Okay, so now you mentioned apocalypticism here in towards the end of your last remarks, and I think that's one of the keys to explaining the possibility that this was again, you've qualified this word, but an ecumenical movement, the believers movement. There's been some criticism of this idea as something that reflects the 21st century more than the seventh. Today, everyone loves, I mean, at least those who care about religion at all, like the idea of, ecumenism and interreligious dialogue, and can't we all get along? And anyway, all religions basically teach the same thing. But the 7th century mindset was religions don't teach the same thing. My religion is the true one, yours is the false one. I'm here to either convince you of it or to subject you to our authority, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, how would you respond to that? I think we've addressed it a little bit, but I don't know if you want to circle back to that criticism and add anything else.
Yeah, sure. That's one of the things that Patricia Crona said in an online review of my work, that I was sort of offering the nice, tolerant view of Islam that modern liberals want, Well, that certainly wasn't my intention when I wrote the book, and I don't think that's what the book does or what my work generally does, because I think I'm quite clear in the book on a bunch of things. I talk about the ecumenicism, as I call it there, because I didn't have another word, but it's really the fact that this movement is not restricted by confession. So people from other confessions, as we might call them, from different Christian or Jewish or whatever groups, if they have the right beliefs, if they believe in one God, the last day, and they live righteously, they can be part of the believers movement. They might still be a Jew or a Christian, but they're a part of the believers movement. Okay. So that's maybe not ecumenicism, but it's some kind of blurring of the borders of things. But there's another section in that same chapter, actually, where I talk about ecumenicism, where I talk about the intensity of their beliefs and the sort of uncompromising pietism. I don't think of these people as sort of easygoing kumbaya types. I think of them as very hard-nosed and narrow-minded, probably. If you didn't believe the basic things that they thought you should believe, that there's one God, the last day, and you need to live righteously, you were simply not in the fold. You were not a believer, and you were, not part of their group at all. So I don't think it was this sort of easygoing toleration. It was more clear-sighted than that. It's just that the clear-sightedness did not draw lines around different religious confessions. It looked at what people actually believed and how they acted, rather than what the tag was that they belonged to. And it's also important to remember that even though, for example, in the 6th century and into the 7th, there were Christian communities in the Near East that fought each other bitterly in polemics and considered the Monophysites considered the Chalcedonians heretics and vice versa, and they all considered the Church of the East to be heretics and vice versa. They had nothing good to say about each other. And yet, as Jack Danus has shown, these people cross the lines all the time. The priest in this village, Monophysite village, is away for a month. Somebody dies in the village. They go to the next village. He's Chalcedonian. They bring their priest to give the last rites on their guy to be buried because he needed to be buried. And well, at least he's a Christian. He's the wrong kind. People marry somebody from the other community and join it for 25 years, and then they move back to the original community. We have all this, as Tanus has shown very nicely in his book, drawing on, I guess, Jacob of Edessa's epistles or responsa from his priests and bishops writing to him. There are all kinds of cases of people crossing these boundaries, including the boundaries with the Muhaggaraye, as they're called in his sources, what we would call the believers of the Muslims. A wonderful one that he brings up, you can also find it in Hoyland's collection of translated sources from Jacob of Edessa, of a priest writes to Jacob of Edessa, the bishop, saying, one of the members of my congregation is a woman, and she's married a Muhaggab, a Muslim, as we would say, but she's a Christian. And I told her that, because she's married this Muhaggar, I'm not going to give her the Eucharist. She can't take communion. But now the Muhaggar is threatening to kill me if I don't give her the Eucharist. So what kind of boundaries are these? It's a very interesting insight into the sort of fluidity of things at this time. As I say, perhaps Tanusa's description of this as a kind of period of confusion is maybe the best one. People are working out in their own minds and for their own communities exactly what the borders are. And then once they get the borders exactly established, then people cross them anyway, as we all do when we have borders in our lives, you know, whether they're national, religious, or whatever.
Exactly, exactly. So there's another element to the argument that I wanted to touch on before we conclude. And I think it's actually related to part of the arguments of Jack Tannous. By the way, shameless plug for another episode that viewers will find on Exploring the Quran and the Bible with Jack Tannous. Was one of the first interviews I did. So look that up and hear more about his arguments in regard to the simple believers of the early Islamic Middle East and late antique Middle East. Yeah, but this notion of simple believers actually seems, although I think, you know, he uses this term after you published Muhammad and the Believers, but it seems to be a nice way of encapsulating the specific argument you have about how Muslims, let's just, maybe this is a little too romantic or fantastical, but let's say, you know, soldiers out in the Islamic conquest on the front lines, fighting together with a Christian who was part of the Believers movement. And, you know, you sort of anticipate the objection. Well, wait a second. Yeah, the Quran does say nice things about Christians. You alluded before to Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 82, where it says those closest in love to the believers are Christians. But it also says, you know, pretty polemical things about their beliefs. In Surah At-Tawbah, for example, it's in verses 29 and 30. Verse 29 says basically, fight them until they are submissive or they give the jizya in submission. But then you say, listen, you know, if we're imagining our soldiers out on the front lines in, say, I don't know, 650s, something like that, would everyone have known everything that's in the Quran? Was everyone literate? What did people actually know about the Quran? So yeah, could you elaborate on that? And have you thought more about that argument? Do you still find it compelling?
Well, one can think about it, but the problem is we don't have any evidence to actually prove it one way or the other. But, you know, one thing we can be sure of, though, is that, you know, we know that nobody in the 7th century could simply go online and check a verse of the Quran, or for that matter, probably go into their library and pull off a copy. That, you know, there weren't any. It was something that people knew bits and pieces of from recitation, perhaps, and maybe they only knew a few verses. They knew certain
enough for prayer, maybe, or
yes, and that's also a puzzling thing. You know, the Quran, Islamic law, sort of mandates that when you're performing the salat, you should recite verses of the Quran, but it never tells you which one. None, well, except for the Fatiha. There's no liturgy in the, say, Christian sense of a liturgy, where for every Sunday, every occasion, there's a specific passage of scripture that's required. That's certainly not the case in Quran. You know, it says you should recite something, but any verse that you want. It has to be at least one long verse or 3 short verses, something like that, if you read it, you know, in the Hanafi text. But there's nothing stipulated for what, you know, you would think that they might have developed a liturgy like, well, this is the prophet's birthday, we're going to read these verses. This is the date of the Hijrah, we're going to read these, you know, this is the Battle of Uhud, this is the battle, you know, we don't know. That none of that exists as a liturgy coming from the Quran text. That's kind of a detour, I'm sorry.
Yes, yeah, okay, great. So I mean, I found that a very compelling part of the argument, and something that's often just completely forgotten, because we, you know, scholars in the field of Quranic studies, they debate the origins of the Quran, its collection, and then canonization acceptance, but they don't really ask the question of its dissemination or diffusion among the believers. And I mean, I think if you think of the contemporary example, just and we live in the internet age, but whether it's Islam or Christianity, if you go out on the streets, you know, people's knowledge is, well, different, depending on who you ask. They may know more or less of the Quran. Yeah, and if we think back to the mid 7th century, we would be in an even more fluid situation.